Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Angela, and I am thrilled to have with me today Katie Turner. And Katie is a registered psychologist, speaker, and the founder of Katie Turner Psychology, Inc., and the author of her book, which is F Toxic Spirituality: Avoiding Red Flags and Navigating the Spiritual Path with Integrity. And I love that. Katie believes in a holistic approach to healing. She has studied a wide range of Western psychological approaches and Eastern healing techniques. Katie is passionate about helping her clients to heal the past, find more peace in the present, and to create their best possible future. Her mission is to bring together the science of psychology to the practice of spirituality. She offers consultation services, sessions, workshops, and resources for organizations and modern day spiritual speakers. She lives in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, with her daughter and rescue dog. When she is not holding space in her practice or working on her latest project, you can find her exploring the Rocky Mountains or on her yoga mat. So, thank you so much for being here today, and welcome to the podcast, Katie.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. And I stumbled on your book because I was like, oh, but I am so excited about the content of this book because I have too tried to be a little bit too positive in my journey. And so before we get into that, I want to just get you to tell the audience just a little bit about how you got to doing what you do now.
Yeah, so it's been about 2 decades ago that my first intuitive awakening started happening. I was already established into the field of psychology. I was already finished postgrad, looking at registration, would have considered myself pretty skeptical. Maybe like, okay, if spirituality helps people, it's maybe a placebo effect. Like if we believe in it, our brain's pretty powerful, not much more than that. Then it was kind of my own burnout and disillusionment in the field itself with just conscious mind approaches. It felt pretty limited. And I ended up going to India and Nepal, which started my awakening journey. And that's where my intuition started opening up. I started experiencing non-ordinary states of consciousness. In terms of the grief and loss piece, I talk a bit about in the book of like I had mediumship abilities open up. I mean, I had a lot of things happen that my rational mind wouldn't have been able to explain or believe was true. And I spent a number of years really looking for theories, research, trainings, perspective of can I even bring this into psychology? How would I? It just really changed my whole worldview from we're alone and just this mind and who knows what happens after to really feeling and knowing you're connected to something bigger and being able to communicate, whether you call that source, God, energy, like spirituality is really our connection with something bigger than us. Organized religions more of the groups, the practices, the rules. So you can be both. You could just be one. You could be one or the other or none. But I really think we all have that connection within us, and a lot of the quantum physics science start like helps to maybe explain a bit of that. There's more and more research coming out that's confirming a lot of those spiritual principles. But then I've also specialized in this area of like depth psychology and spiritual awakening, transpersonal psychology for the last decade now. And there were themes that just kept coming up over and over again. And I think there's a lot of stuff on social media, well-meaning, like our Western culture is pretty like positive mindset,
Mhm.
manifestation. And there's definitely, I'm not knocking that. There's a time and place for positivity. There's like gratitude practice. Like those are science-based tools, but there's no one tool that gives everybody what they need at every point. So if we're trying to slam these things down people's throats at every point of the journey, there's times where it can be helpful and there's times where it's actually really harmful or gaslighting or just very dismissive. And our culture as a whole isn't great at holding just empathetic space for hard, like really hard times. It's uncomfortable. So I find on the spiritual journey, especially when we're talking about grief, loss, like terminal illness, tragedy, we're usually not great at holding space for that. And I think there's lots of ways we can get better. When we know better, we can show up better.
Yeah, I love that.
Mhm.
And this whole idea of manifestation was really prominent for me when my husband was sick.
Yeah.
And I got this feeling that if I just stayed positive enough,
Yeah. Yeah.
that he would get better. And
Yeah.
I remember searching, trying to figure out,
Mm.
how positive do I need to be? Because this is
Yeah.
not very much fun. And then feeling guilty because maybe I'm not being positive
Yeah.
enough and maybe I'm causing this.
Oh
I
my
went
God.
through
Yeah.
all of that.
And it's so common and so few people can talk about it openly because I don't think it's even personal. Like I hear this one-on-one with clients all the time because the people around them too are like, here's this article about green juice and cancer, and here's this without even asking of like, do you want me to send this?
Right.
Is this going to be helpful or not? So yeah, I just have a lot of compassion for that because it happens
Yeah.
so often.
Yeah, and somebody like you would have been really helpful for me, but I didn't know that at the time. In fact, I really thought, well, what's somebody going to tell me that's going to help, right? There was always
Yeah.
that kind of mindset. And yeah, it was a time where I was really searching for more
Hmm.
support in that area, and there really wasn't any. And so
Yeah.
every time I find somebody who really understands this whole idea of manifestation and spirituality and how we're still human,
Yes.
even though we have this spiritual aspect. Now,
Yes.
it would have been really hard for you, I think. Because you come from that area of psychology
Hmm.
and have that more scientific background or
Hmm.
set of rules that you might need to follow,
Hmm.
rightfully so, but then have
Yeah.
to marry it with the whole spirituality. And I think that's fascinating because I think somebody like you is going to have a way broader perspective and a more
Hmm.
encompassing type of therapy than
Hmm.
just one or the other.
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be one or the other, and I think the field is slowly catching up. And spirituality is such an interesting one because when I did more of my own studying with it, because I was having experiences where I didn't know where to put those in terms of Western psychology isn't great in terms of classifying spiritual experiences. The DSM, like Diagnostic Statistical Manual, if you are getting visitations from a deceased loved ones, your angels, like there's not a lot of places to put that.
Yeah.
And many people, I think rightfully so, are very hesitant to talk to a mental health professional. And I think sometimes you do need to be careful because and both sides, like part of what I talk about in the book too is sometimes spiritual communities can go too far one way and say like, oh, this is just a spiritual awakening, and it's like there may be mental health things playing out here too. This may not be a stable or safe spiritual awakening. Like this might have, we are complex, like multi-layered beings. There's usually not just one answer or another, and that's sort of the danger of not having any, is there something else going on here model going on. But there's also other times where it's like this is intuition and spiritual, and it's not necessarily any disorder. It's not necessarily, like I know a lot of the ways I experience the world. I'd be hesitant to full out talk to a psychiatrist or someone about it who had no spiritual lens because I know what kind of boxes they might be ticking for that. But if you're grounded in 3D reality, it's just so interesting because there's a Gallup poll out of the US that talks about it's about 41 or 42% of the population rated 5 out of 5 on a question of like, have you ever had a profound spiritual or religious experience that changed the course of your life? Like that is almost half the population rated that as like 100%. That is not a small number, but it is one of these areas that so affects people and many people have deep and personal experiences with, but we don't talk about it with other people because we're scared of being stigmatized, of it being like, are you going kind of quote unquote crazy? And so the more I went into my own journey, the more I realized there's actually a lot of people who experience this. We just don't really talk about it. Like it's taboo. And I mean, part of the intuitive calling for me has been stepping up to speak more publicly about it because I've also seen like the book is actually it's not as controversial as the title. The title's kind of jarring, but it's people read it and they're like, "Oh, this isn't really what I thought it was going to be." It's actually a lot gentler. But it is also it was written out of my own frustration because there's not many there's a lot of people speaking in the spiritual space and a lot of it's unregulated. So when you Google spiritual awakenings, if you Google like what happens, manifesting serious illness. How do I do this? A lot of what you get on Google, you have to be so careful going through it. There can be some helpful stuff out there, but there can be it is the wild west of
Mhm.
people spouting opinions. And when we're going through stuff like that, it's really hard to know, who can I trust? What are some questions to guide me in this? Like, what do I need to know that I don't know?
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. So tell me a little bit. I feel like I had a spiritual awakening through this grief journey.
Mhm.
Tell me, how do you define spiritual awakening?
Yeah, I think a lot of the common definitions have in common of a spiritual awakening is, I'd often say it's going beyond this rational, here's the reasons to believe in a higher power or God, source, whatever. Like, I've analyzed it, I've looked at the philosophical debates, the evidence, and I believe or not. A spiritual awakening experience is like you have actual experiences where you're like, I get it. For me, I totally get it. I'm like, I wouldn't have believed this if someone just told me. It would have been a rational exercise. I've had enough experiential things happen that I'm like, there is something else going on here.
Mhm.
Like, because I've worked and I had to work to develop my intuition. It is a skill that I used to think people just, maybe you had it or you didn't. I do think we can develop it. That's been my experience. Some people naturally just come into the world with it more turned on than others. Some of us, we have to learn to remember how to connect with it.
Mhm.
But I've had enough where it also, the experiences or the messages or the things that have come through there has been validated in real life for me. And there's no way my rational mind would have known. So my rational mind does trust it more now. Like, it's not an exact. You gotta be
Mhm.
careful with it. It's not always like, your rational mind should also be on board. Don't make major decisions with it until you're a lot more grounded in it by
Right.
itself. But it does have those things come through. I've had experiences within my own family with pets, with loved ones, where this soul or spiritual message is like, this person is going. This is their soul path. There is no manifesting them living anymore. They're
Okay.
at the end of their soul journey. And like, our time here is limited. And I don't think birth and death are things our ego is here to control. And there can be powerful stories, there can be miracles, but that has to align with something higher up soul level for someone's path. And a lot of times people take that and then take it as, oh no, we shouldn't ever get sick or die then, because we don't
Right.
want to look at that. It's too
Right.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the tricky thing,
Mhm.
because when you're going through what I went through,
Mhm.
and then he passed away, and then there was all this guilt. Maybe I could have done something. Maybe we should
Yeah.
have done this, done that, da, da, da,
Mhm.
da, da. But then understanding down the road, it takes a while, but you start to get your head around the fact that, well, there may be these soul contracts. And actually, intuitively, I truly believe there was a contract.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then that takes away some of that and starts to help you form or make sense of
Yeah.
something so incredibly devastating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and the spiritual, like, a lot of times people will be like, oh, well, they're in a better place or this. And I
Mm.
think, like, I've come to experience, I know, I've felt that, I've known that. I've had deceased people, like people I love who are deceased, pets, loved ones, like, come through, give messages. Like, it's beautiful, it's amazing, but it also doesn't take away that we still have to go through the human grief. I say in my book, it's like mediumship abilities are like a spotty Skype connection from halfway around the world. Like, you don't get to see them, you don't get to hug them, you don't control, you still miss them. I'm a big proponent too of, yes, we are spiritual beings, but we are here in a human body and nervous system and human experience, and we're both, and we need to honor both. We can't bypass. Um, there's times where it's like we need to be in the anger, the upset, like move through our own emotions, be like, I don't like that this is happening.
Hmm.
And when we can move through that, it's like we can be more open for that knowing to just kind of come in. And grief and loss is one of those ones that it's often one that so many people who wouldn't call themselves spiritual or intuitive will have experiences with, where they're like, I had a dream of this person, or they showed up, or there was just this sign for them. They're like, smelled them. But it's so common for people to have those experiences too.
Yes, absolutely. And because of that,
Mhm.
my life started to take on a completely different form,
Mhm.
because everything was uprooted.
Mhm.
And on this journey, I was being very positive, of
Mhm.
course. So it's like, well, I'm helping other people. This feels good. This is helping me. And then there was a point at which I realized that there was a part of me that wasn't happy
Yeah.
with all of this,
Yeah.
that actually she didn't like this because it was not the retirement that I dreamed of. I dreamed of having this retirement with my husband. And so
Yeah.
for the longest time, I pushed her aside,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that sounds silly, but I mean,
No,
it,
it makes sense. I do a lot of parts. Like
mhm,
we all have parts.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then I had to realize at some point that I had to acknowledge
Yeah.
that there was that sadness about that, and that actually is there, and
Yeah.
yet still live this very joyful, fulfilling life at the
For
same
sure.
time.
And that helps us live a joyful and fulfilling life. Like our mind, it's like this black and white of like we need to feel good or this, and but we need to actually be able to move through the emotions and ride the waves and be like what's actually naturally coming up right now, like what part of me needs attention, what part of me is ready to be felt, and be able to move through that and give ourselves the space and like the grace to, because yes, like our we can have that soul connection, and our human self still needs to be like, I am pissed off, and if someone gave me the choice of this or this, I'd be like, I did not want this. Even
Yeah.
if soul level there's a contract and that message came through for myself. And I really think we got to be really careful about ever putting that on anyone else, and like really getting consent for that, because people will often be like, oh, but you had a soul contract, or like this is what you signed
Mhm.
up for, and it's like, screw you.
Yeah.
That like you check in first. Like, is that going to be helpful for them? Because they might need to just.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, like you say, if you acknowledge that and you
Mhm.
allow those emotions to move through you, then you can lift those and release them. And
Yeah,
then you have room for more joy.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but you have to go through it, like you
You
say,
do.
just
You
have
do.
to. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think our culture is just very scared of, most of us were raised, there's many generations that were just in survival. Not a lot of our parents had high emotional intelligence or maturity to hold like the duality of these spaces, to feel these big things and move through them, to like when we can do that, we're actually strong. Like it's not going to break us. We're stronger. Our
Mhm.
heart can open up even more and hold even more. Like I think if we can move through heartbreak, it's like we can expand our capacity, our maturity, our compassion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit more about your book. What can people expect?
Yeah, it's kind of just, again, I put it together based on these are kind of the most common things I see coming up. And something kept coming up in work with clients who are really navigating that connection with their own intuition. That's something I help people with, along with healing the past, like that parts work, that inner child stuff, trauma healing, and that connection with like again soul self. Like what are those intuitive messages? Like not me telling them that, but opening up the space for that to kind of drop in for themselves as we move through things. But I think there was just so many things that people kept asking me, or I kept seeing them like beating themselves up over or really wrestling with, where I just kept saying over and over again, well, how would you have known this? There's no manual. Like it is really tough going through this. There's no roadmap. There's no manual. If you Google this, like when I was going through my spiritual awakening and looking all over, looking at for guidance in some of the wrong places where I didn't realize it, to be like, oh, this is a well-known, internationally recognized spiritual teacher or healer, and be like, oh God, red flags, like no association. Keep my money. Do not work with you. But just seeing how common it is, and seeing how dangerous that, like sometimes it's really well meaning and people just not knowing what they don't know. So the book is to help people navigate that, and also if you are holding space and working in these areas, maybe there's some reflection questions to help you know better, stay within your lane of competency, do better as well, but also to help people have guidance of how do you actually help, what are some questions to consider, what resources might be helpful, what are things you may not know that could be helpful to know, so you're not ending up like getting gaslit, manipulated, like
Mm,
have somebody's shadow stuff coming out in their work with you, or actually be working with like a dangerous or toxic kind of personality type in that work.
mhm. Yeah, and that's something that I've had to learn along the way, is to really trust my own
Hmm.
discernment when you're
Yes.
working with people. And there's lots of people that I resonate with and lots of
Hmm.
people that maybe I don't. And
Yeah.
I can really feel that. I
Hmm.
know that And I think you learn that over time. It's like
Yeah.
trusting that whole intuition thing, and then having the guidance from your book would be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, I wasn't unique. I was all, for me, the intuitive path, like the first part of it, actually, even opening to it being a real thing, was not listening to it.
Yeah.
I think most of us learned that way. It's like rational mind overriding it. Oh, you're being anxious. You're overthinking this. You're judging them and being like, oh no, that gut feeling was right the whole time.
And, with your background, that's just fascinating that you would have that kind of battle going on within you, and I think over time, and I'm the same because I overthink everything. But, it's not a bad quality. It's just that when you get to that space where you start to trust a little bit more in
Yeah.
what feels right and what doesn't.
Yeah, and it's a process. Like I think there's again another one of the kind of toxic spirituality messages I see a lot. It's like just trust, just trust. Like I'm like, no, man. I I'm doing this work now professionally. I've like built and manifested something that I didn't even know if it was possible or not. And I was not fully trusting the entire journey. There was enough, I think you have to have enough trust to take a leap of faith. But I
Mhm.
do think our like rational should be supporting the intuitive too. Like we often need a business plan or it
Right.
doesn't have to be immediate. There's breadcrumbs we follow over time, but the trust is built. Like we don't trust with people, trust with ourselves, trust with our intuition. It does. I have much more trust in it now, but there's still times even today where I'll be like, I don't know. I'll
Mhm.
see. Like this is how much I'm willing to put on the line right now. And then but I also don't think it has to be 100%. Like it has to, and I trust it more because I've had the feedback loop of, okay, I'm learning what this is. These are the messages that are coming through. This is the evidence over time of like this was correct or not, or this knew something that I couldn't logically understand, and now it makes sense.
Right.
So I trust it a lot more because I've worked with it and I've earned that trust, and it takes time. And it's also not an individual coming for any of us because our culture and society is rational mind dominated. We are taught from such a young age to plan things, reverse engineer. We're not taught to connect with I think that's changing with newer generations of parenting, of letting kids trust their own body autonomy and not forcing them to be nice or give hugs. Like, you don't feel good with someone, you don't have to hug them. Like,
Yeah. Hmm.
you don't feel weird, we're going to actually listen to you and like respect your opinion here and find out what's going on. I wasn't raised like that. I know many people weren't. So we often have to, and we may have had experiences where we're picking up on everything and we're like, this feels tense or it doesn't feel good, but everybody's pretending that it's fine. Or they're like, what are you talking about? I'm fine. And so we don't understand if sometimes the intuitive information is just for us to know. It doesn't mean other people are ready to go there themselves. They might not be trying to gaslight us, but they might not be ready to face certain truths for themselves. So it really is an ongoing process. And I just think if anyone wants that connection, treat it like a process, not an end destination.
Right. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense to me too. That's really how the journey has been. And I'm still
Yeah.
weighing the evidence.
It's still a journey that's unfolding for me as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, how do people work with you, or how do they contact you if they like what they hear?
So my website's probably the best place. It's katieturnerpsychology.com. I've got a free discovery or dominant intuitive type quiz on there. And then there's like a 6-week series that's free to deepen your intuition. And then you can get the book there as well. There's like
Nice.
a bonus workshop there. And I'm still in the kind of intuitive co-creation space of doing more groups and workshops so that people from outside of Alberta can work with me as well.
Awesome. Before we go, just give you a chance to share any advice or message that you want.
Yeah, I think the thing that's been kind of front and center for me in the last well, probably since the new year actually, is we're in such kind of turbulent world times, and there's a lot of fear energy, a lot of concern. And so I think it's more important than ever that we have ways to come back to this kind of inner knowing. Because I honestly don't know how I'd still be doing this work if I was only using cognitive techniques to be like, oh, fine, let's just think our way out of climate change and political this and that. When we can have that intuitive space and have that space, it can really help us shift towards, yes, there's all these hard human things going on, but it can actually help give us a feeling of relief or reassurance or coming back to like we can still feel okay even in really hard things too, and know that we can get through it or be guided to get through it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really important
Mhm.
because it feels like you can't trust.
Mhm.
You don't know what's true. You don't know what's not. You don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of
Mhm.
change taking place. And so having something that you can believe is out there
Mhm.
and supporting you in all of that, I think
Mhm.
is helpful.
And I think it can also bring us back to our own guidance of like, how do we feel like we do matter and what is important to our values and like feels good and purposeful. It might be even just guidance to reach out to a friend, like little
Mhm.
moments of connection, community, like where our lives do have this ripple effect around
Right.
us, like even if we can't control the wider world.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that because that's really what you do for yourself, you're doing for
Yeah.
everyone. And that's a huge message for people too, because you feel like alone you can't do much. But in
Yeah.
effect, you really are quite powerful by yourself.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And I encourage everybody to go check out your website and your book. And I want to thank everyone for listening. And bye for now.